Hello, everyone, and welcome to LaKesha and Friends. I'm so excited to be joined today by Chuck Williams, who we actually became friends maybe a year or so ago when he was picking my brains about a couple of topics, and we found that we had a lot in common. And so I'm super excited to have him sharing with us today. So, Chuck, please introduce yourself to our audience.
Hi, thank you, LaKesha. First and foremost, let me thank you for this opportunity to get in front of everyone. I do want to say that, it was probably about a year ago officially, but unofficially, we were at our Connectional Lake Council convention back in 2017.
Oh,
I'm the one that asked the question about what does the hashtag mean?
I remember that
And
in Tennessee, right?
yes, yes. And you gave me the answer so that I would not look like a technology, that I was somewhere in a cave or something. So I thank you for that. I also want to thank you because, yes, when I was appointed district director for voter registration, someone gave me your name to reach out to because you were doing some things for the denomination, AME Zion denomination. And that's right. You gave me a lot of helpful information. I was very impressed. I just want to thank you because you put me on the road that I'm on now in terms of working with the voting process. So I thank you for that. I don't know, what else would you like to know? Did I give you enough information there?
Yes, that was very helpful. But you didn't tell us the fact that you are the voter engagement coordinator. I think I got that right.
Yeah.
For the Project 100 that the AME Zion Church is doing. So tell us a little bit about what that project entails and what you guys are working on.
Sure. So Project 100 was put together by our Board of Bishops, and the initiative is to have 100% of AME Zion members participating in the elections this year. So it goes beyond just being registered to vote. It's actually participating in the voting process.
Really? So tell me a little bit about what does participation mean, outside of voting?
So participation is not only voting, but it is also encouraging our friends, our neighbors, our co-workers to get involved in the voting process also. For example, there are a number of what they call infomercials that they're putting out, and will really put out a big push starting next week or so. Where we're sending that out to all members who have registered for the database, and the expectation is that they're going to be able to share those videos with their friends, their neighbors, everyone. We want to get as many people voting as possible, and we want the AME Zion, the Freedom Church, to really be an integral part of the voting process this year.
Wonderful. So as you've been working with people to get out the vote, what are some of the, pushbacks that you've heard as to why people are not more engaged or not planning to vote?
That's interesting. As a matter of fact, I will be hosting call it a webinar, if you will, my local church on Thursday. And one of the things that we're going to talk about, there's two things. One is, as far as the African-American vote is concerned, when I look back at the data, what I saw is that we got really excited when Barack Obama ran for office. We got even more excited in terms of voter registration and participation when he ran for re-election. And right after that happened, things just dropped. Our interest dropped. We didn't have the excitement anymore, I guess, because Barack Obama was not on the ticket.
Right.
That resulted in several areas across the country, and I have gone through and verified a lot of these facts, several areas across the country where in major cities, the voting numbers had dropped so significantly that in a number of those battleground states that Trump won, the Black vote was not as strong as it had been in the past. Had it been as strong as it was in the past, we might be looking at a different situation right now, because those battleground states were key to turning the tide of the election.
So why do you think, and you may not have research on this, but just like your personal thoughts, like why do you think people weren't as excited in 2016 to vote as they were for Barack Obama? Because we had a chance to make history again by electing the first woman president, but there just didn't seem to be an equal amount of excitement around that.
Yeah, there were a couple of dynamics at work there. My personal opinion, first and foremost, is that back in 2008, it was a very heated contest between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. And I think within the African American community, some of the love for the Clintons sort of wore off at that time. So folks were not as excited. And the other dynamic were there were a lot of young people who were backing Bernie Sanders. The way the primaries went in 2016, a lot of them felt that they were dismissed, they felt rejected, and they decided not to participate. So it wasn't so much voting for the other side, it was, I'm just not going to vote. All of those factors, I think, led to the fact that it was just a matter of the Democratic candidate not having the voting support
that
they would have.
Right.
And the result, we see what's happening.
Right. So what are you saying to people now, like as you're out and you're talking to people, you're trying to encourage them to participate? What are, some of the things that you're saying to help people who might still feel as though Joe Biden or Donald Trump, like neither of them represent their interests and they're just, planning not to vote again? What are you saying to those people?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So let me set the stage to that, because the first part to that is that there's a lot of folks that are not as excited about Joe Biden.
Right.
And the reason why they're not excited about Joe Biden, what was brought up was the crime bill back in the 90s. The fact of the matter is everyone voted for that crime bill, including the Congressional Black Caucus, because at the time they thought it was a good thing.
Right.
No one saw the unintended consequences of what that crime bill did in leading to extending mass incarceration among African Americans. So to take that now and to just drop all of that on Joe Biden, I think that's unfair. Joe Biden also has admitted, yes, I was wrong. We all were. We didn't see what has happened. So I just wanted to set that as the stage. There are still a number of people that are not happy about Joe Biden because of that situation. There are still some people who are not happy that Bernie Sanders did not get the nomination this time around. Right. We are hoping that they look beyond that, because sometimes voting is not your ideal candidate.
Right.
It is who is going to either further us or who is not going to damage us,
right,
within the next 4 years. You get another chance 4 years from now if someone better comes along. But for now, we have to look at who is in our best interest. So there's one thing for African Americans. The other is for young people. And that was something that I have wrestled with. And let me thank you again, because you pointed out, and I've been going with that you can't approach young people and say, your ancestors fought and died and spilled blood for you. So that was interesting, because there are a lot of people that are still
right
that as an issue, as though this is going to turn the minds of young adults. We have to keep in mind, for a lot of us, we may have grown up during that civil rights period. But for a lot of the young adults, that was over by the time they were born. So they don't have that history. So they're not going to feel the same way about it as we felt back in the baby boomer generation.
Right.
So what I look at when I'm talking to young people is that what you must understand when it comes to the presidency of the United States, whoever sits in that seat is going to be the person who appoints the judges that you may have to face. Right. Whoever sits in that seat will appoint the judges that will decide many of the issues that are important to you today. So
Right.
what you have to look at is who is going to help us the most and who will hurt us the least.
Right.
And that's the focus that I use when I'm speaking with young people.
And I love that because I do feel like this generation is they're much more me centered. So they want to know what's in it for me and how does this affect my life. And I feel like that's been some of the disconnect in the past and why we haven't been able to excite them, as people like to say, because we keep talking about the past and what happened in the past. And for them, it's like, well, that's the past. But one of our guests last week, I think it was William McCorn, was talking about how, their generation has grown up in the era of police brutality.
Exactly.
And sometimes we don't make that connection, not just what happened in the past, but what is happening today and how their vote can be impacted by that. You also do some work around mass incarceration. So can you talk to us a little bit about like the connection between voting and prisons? Because a lot of people don't see, and I've been using the example of Kentucky and their attorney general as an example of us voting down ballot. So it's not just about the president, but, even, unjust prison sentences and how that is impacted by our vote.
I am so glad you brought that up. Because one of the things that I do want to talk about, and let me start with just localizing it in my area here. In the state of Maryland, 70% of the incarcerated population are African-American males. It is the highest in the nation, much more so than Mississippi, much more so than Alabama, places that stereotypically are looked at as places that give African-Americans a hard time. Now, it's not so because Maryland is also what we would call a blue state. So it's kind of, we're trying to understand, okay, how do we get this this strange balance? And we're still trying to look at that. So one of the things that we're looking at is that we get to vote on judges in Maryland. So when you start talking about down ballot, you have to consider, okay, let's start asking these judges. Let's start examining their records. What has it been? I've seen things, and I know Facebook is social media and everything may not necessarily be true, but I have seen things where you may have one judge that will have a case against an African-American and an identical case against, someone who's white. And somehow the sentencing, when it gets down to the sentencing for African Americans is much harder. And in most of the studies that I've been looking at, that is a major problem, is that it's harsher sentencing.
Right.
And what that may stem from, I don't want to go into a long conversation about that, but it is the perception that African Americans are more violent. I was on an online summit last week where they were talking about data, and a lot of the information and prejudices, if you will, that incorporated in data. And they're saying that in a lot of cases, these judges are looking at these computerized simulators or whatever you call it that will determine, should this person be eligible for bail? Should this person be eligible for parole? And what is built into that process is the factor that, well, the African Americans are more violent.
Wow.
So it was amazing to see the sort of things that go into this. So sometimes even when you don't intend to do something that may be determined to be racist, you wind up unknowingly something that's racist because of the data that you're working with.
Yeah, it's a systematic bias that's built into the system. And we've had some law enforcement officers who've been on and talking about voting and just, how important it is for us to train officers about the biases that they bring to the job. And I don't think we've made that connection with judges as well. When you look at the proportion of African Americans that are incarcerated versus white people who commit the same crime, and the fact that we have the power in a lot of instances to elect those judges. Yet we only look at the top of the ticket most of the time, or we only vote for the people that we know, instead of really like taking the time to understand like what is an appellate court judge, what is, you know, a criminal justice, like what are the different judge types and who are we electing to those positions. So I think that that's very important for us to consider.
Exactly, exactly. And oftentimes, as you said, we tend to look at the top of the ticket, in this case, the president of the United States, and we think that that person's going to be elected. They're going to wave a magic wand and everything is going to be better and we'll live happily ever after. And
Right.
that's not necessarily the case, as you point out. So local elections are extremely important because that's what gets us to that next level. You know, it's great if you have somebody in the White House that you can be happy with. Many of us were happy during the Obama administration, but that didn't change the people who were shot, murdered by police officers, or you know, the George Zimmermans of the world. All of that happened during Obama, so it did not go away.
Right.
You know? So we have to pay close attention to what goes on at the local level, as well as what goes on at the national level.
And I think that's so important because even looking at some of those cases, like it also didn't affect like the prosecution of those people and even the police officers that, you know, committed crimes. So I think Mike Brown was during the Obama years as well. And I didn't see as much focus put on the attorney generals at that time, as now we're starting to kind of make the connection like, hey, the attorney general has a role to play in this as well. Or, you know, who are the prosecutors, you know, for the city or for the state. And so I think that I really feel like we're coming to an awakening in our community, especially like the Black community, as to the importance of voting. Because for the longest, like you said, we just felt like we could wave a magic wand and we vote like every 4 years and it all works out, not thinking about those midterm elections. And even in 10, when Obama lost the Congress.
Yes.
And so people thought, you know, he had all this power, he's going to do all these great things. But then when he didn't have Congress anymore, then it really limited the amount of change he was able to make, because we showed up in 8, but then we didn't show up in 10. And so I think that we have to make voting a consistent part of our civic engagement.
Absolutely correct. And I'm glad you brought up 2010, because if you think about it, Obama lost the Senate in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're looking at today is that we're looking at a Supreme Court judge that has been selected, will probably be confirmed.
Mm-hmm.
And 4 years ago, there could have been America Garland in that spot had we come out in 2010, had we come out in 2014, those off years, and make certain that we also not only keep the executive office, but that we also have the legislative branches as well. When we don't look at that, and what that's going to do is that's going to impact what happens to us in the future. I'm in the process right now of reading Carol Anderson's book, One Person, No Vote. It is mind-boggling, the things that are in there that have been done in the past. You know, how voter suppression was designed in a lot of the southern states, and how once you caught on to it, you know, then a new thing would come up. So it's just amazing. And we're looking right now, who would have thought that someone would use or leverage the United States Postal Service in order to affect the outcome of an election? Yeah. Who would have thought that the president of the United States would actually get on nationwide television and encourage his supporters to be poll watchers? And we're not quite sure what that means.
Right, because there's a whole process to become a poll watcher. It's not about you just showing up on election day to monitor what happens. Like, you actually fill out an application and you're assigned to a location. So like you said, like the fact that he's just like, oh, you go show up and be a poll watcher, like that's not exactly what poll watching is. And I want to tell everyone, like, don't just show up at a polling location like thinking that, you know, you can dictate what's happening. If you want want to be a part of the process, there's an application that you can fill out to do it officially. But otherwise, like that can be considered voter intimidation. And I think like there are laws against that.
Yes, there are. But if you don't know what those laws are, or if you don't know what to expect when someone comes up and questions why you're at the poll, he's talking about using sheriffs. And I have seen this
right
in the past where sheriffs, law enforcement will show up at the polls, and it intimidates some of the potential voters because they don't want to be questioned. They, for whatever reason, they don't want to have that encounter with law enforcement. So just the mere fact of having someone show up can be a factor that causes the whole voting in that precinct to change. And one of the things that they're talking about is that their concern and fear is that the supporters of this current president may show up not necessarily at Republican precincts,
right,
but at Democratic precincts or heavily Democratic precincts. So, and usually you'll find, I lived in Jersey City, New Jersey when I grew up. We had a mayor once, and that was his voting strategy, was to tamp down the black vote. I can't believe he actually put that down in his notes in writing so that other people can see it. Tamp down the black vote. We also have to look at, and what's coming up is the census. We have to look at that because that's a situation where they will change things around.
Yeah.
It's something that they call packing, where they say, okay, we're going to take all of the traditional black voting areas, we're going to condense them into one area. Now, that's great. That means you elect someone who looks like you, but you only have that one person. So whether or not they have influence on the city council, whether or not they have influence in the state legislature, forgive me, whether they have influence in Congress, because, somehow they've restructured your voting area so that minimize the amount of influence and power that your voting area will have. There's also what they call dilution, where they'll take your voting area, they'll spread it across, so many areas so that your voting influence is so diluted that it has virtually no impact whatsoever. So these are the things that we have to look out for when it's not only voting for president, but we're going to have to look at that census. Once they start to redistrict, we're going to have to look at that, and we're going to have to understand what the proposals mean, and we're going to have to understand how that will affect our communities, and we have to be prepared to fight. We can't sleep on this. As they say, stay woke.
Yes.
This is an area.
They're busy, and it's and that's been I think the problem that we've had in our community is that we have not been awake in the political process, and we have not been paying as much attention as I think that we should be, because even when you look at gentrification in a lot of our communities, I tell people that gentrification does not happen overnight. Your city had a plan 20 years ago for what they were going to do, but because we were not at those meetings, we were not on the city council, we were not involved in the planning commissions, we weren't a part of those conversations, the next thing you know, you look up and there's a Starbucks and people walking their dog and you're trying to figure out what happened.
Yes. And that's what, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I live just outside of Washington, D.C., and I hear on the radio all the time, they talk about, how the community was, and all of a sudden there were bike paths put in, there were doggy parks put in, and the next thing you know, there were people telling them that the rules are going to change.
Right.
And one of the things since you brought that up, one of the things that you might want to be mindful of, this president likes to talk about that he's done so much more for the blacks than any president since Abraham Lincoln. And one of the things that he cites is this urban plan that he has. And if you look at the plan is not helping people. The plan is actually helping real estate, construction. So gee, it sounds nice. We're going to put new housing in the area, et cetera, et cetera. But are you going to be able to afford that housing?
Right. Right.
I think it's like another precursor to gentrification of the community. So whereas it's being painted as though it's a helpful tool,
Right.
that may not be the case in the long run.
Yeah. And I think it's very important, and hopefully you'll be able to come back again after the elections, because I really want to continue these conversations as issues come up, because our people really need to be informed beyond just presidential politics, but to start making more connections to, mass incarceration and private prisons and, urban renewal programs that they call that are actually just gentrification. But, how do we spot those things, and then what power do we have? Because I think in a lot of instances we feel powerless when actually you can go to the planning commission meetings, you can go to your city council, you can be a voice in those spaces before the vote is had, and to let your council people, your representatives know that you don't approve. And I think that even in the church, like, we don't lobby, and that's one thing that I've been talking to people about. Like, you have the power to lobby. Like, lobbying is not just for rich white corporations, but you can get a group of your church members and you can go talk to your city council person, you can go talk to your state legislator and let them know how you feel about an issue. That has nothing to do with separation of church and state, because you are a tax-paying citizen, and as tax-paying citizens who happen to go to the same church, you can let people know what your position is. But we have to take back our power in a lot of these spaces.
Well, and thank you for pointing that out. There is, if I can say, and I do want to leave your audience with something to think about. In the AME Zion Church, of course, the way we're structured, we have presiding elder districts, and my presiding elder 2 weeks ago brought in an attorney to speak about liabilities in the church. And one of the areas that she covered was voting. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was interesting because two things she pointed out is, one is that we're all under the concern that the 501c3 rules, which sort of say you have to be nonpartisan and not endorse candidates, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that does not apply to churches. That applies to nonprofit organizations.
Right.
And, wow. And then she said to further, enforce that or reinforce that, this president signed an executive order,
he did,
giving that sort of freedom to what he thought was just going to be the evangelical white church. But we can use that same thing. So just as he's expanded that in order to speak freely as a church, we have the ability to do that. Right. And whether we look at it from the traditional point of view or we look at it from the executive order that he put out there. So that's one thing that I want to say. But the other thing that I want to say is that, and this is when I lived in Jersey, and outside of New York City some years ago, back in the 1980s, listening to the radio one night, and they had an African-American politician on there. And one of the things that he said was that within the he said in most communities, you will achieve your economic power first and use that for your political influence. He said, in the African-American community, we're doing it the opposite way. He says, it doesn't mean it won't work. It just means that it will take longer.
Right.
And my thought was, well, why don't we do it like everyone else did?
Right.
When you look at our history, when you look at the oppression that we went through, when you look at Jim Crow, when you look at all of the things that have happened in our history in this country, you begin to understand we can't get to the economic empowerment that we need to have, that we need, So the first things that we have to do, sort of taking a proverbial quote that was used this year in the George Floyd case, is we have to get the knee off of our neck before we even get to that point. So it's something to think about. It's our political power is extremely important, because we're not going to be able to get to those next levels until we can at least clear the way so that we have just as much of a legal right and political right as every other ethnic group in these United States.
Well, I could talk to you like all day. As you can see, I told you it's only gonna be 10 or 15 minutes, but we run like over that time.
Yeah,
But
like wow, yeah, almost a half hour.
right. But I want to thank you so much for sharing, because I really do believe like these conversations are so important for us to have, and just for people to start thinking more deeply about civic engagement. Because so many people say, oh, it doesn't affect me, but politics actually affects every area of your life, whether you believe it or not. So before we go, what parting words do you have to share with anyone who's on the fence about voting, who's just like, I don't know, does my vote really matter? What do you have to say to those people?
Very simple. If you don't think your vote matters, look at how much they are doing to keep you from voting.
Right.
I can't say it any better than that. If you don't think your vote matters, look at what they're doing to keep you from voting.
Wonderful.
And again, I'm sorry, I don't want to elaborate, but look at what's happening in Texas.
Yeah.
Okay, where all of a sudden, they're restricting the amount of drop-off boxes that, I saw something. It's going to take some people 2 hours to go from one side of their county to the other in order to drop off their ballot. Their ballot. So if you don't think your vote is important, look at the things they're doing to keep you from voting.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. And thank you also for your friendship and just all of the hard work that I know you're doing in the community and what you're doing with the Rethinking Church. So you guys will definitely see some of the work. We'll come back on another show to talk about that. But just thank you for everything that you're doing.
Well, LaKesha, thank you. And I don't know if you realize how important the things you're doing these days are and the impact that it's going to make. We applaud you.
Well, thank you. Thank you.